this culminating event of the series Recalibrating the Compass, What Future for Asia-Europe Cultural Relations. A few small housekeeping matters before we start. You will be able to input your questions in the live chat box, and then you will also be able to ask anything or share anything through the same chat box. We are also streaming on YouTube, so if you're not able to join on Zoom, you may have received also the YouTube link, or probably you've seen it on our social media channels. Before we dig into the discussion, I would like to invite ASEF Executive Director, Ambassador Morikawa, to say a few words to open the floor and welcome you here. Ambassador Morikawa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valentina. Greetings from the Asia-Europe Foundation, ASEF. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's public forum titled Asia-Europe Cultural Relations, A Look Ahead. This conversation is the final and culminating event of the consultation process initiated by ASEF Culture Department in May last year in celebration of ASEF 25th anniversary. Through a series of 5 roundtables, we have discussed with more than 60 experts in the field on the most pressing issues for Asia-Europe cultural relations and what role organizations such as ASEF can play in this time of great geopolitical unrest and post-pandemic recovery. Tonight, with the help of our 6 esteemed speakers from the arts and the culture sectors of the 2 regions, we will take a step forward and look ahead at what the future looks like and what we can do to improve it and contribute to it. I hope this conversation will inspire you to create new connections and develop new projects in the spirit of new and more meaningful cultural relations. Thank you for your attention and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much to Ambassador Morikawa for these welcome remarks. And once again, welcome to everyone. Before going into presenting our speakers for tonight, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a context for this conversation this evening. As you probably know, we've started in 2022 on the occasion of ASEF's 25th anniversary, and following the global pandemic and the sort of relaunch from that, we decided to launch this series of conversation entitled Recalibrating the Compass. And the idea was to examine current challenges and identify ways to develop new, more relevant and resilient forms of support for Asia-Europe cultural cooperation. We invited 60 speakers from our partner stakeholders from a variety of backgrounds: independent artists, arts organizations, networks, governments, public institutions, to take part in these roundtables. And what emerged from it is that the consultation revealed several challenges that the cultural sector and the development of relation is facing. The more important thing was the fact that inequalities within the cultural sector were already present before, but they were exacerbated and accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Among others, the increased digital divide for professionals in the arts, the lack of access to training opportunities and networking, restrictions to cultural mobility, the impact of the climate crisis on the cultural sector, and also issues related to fair and sustainable practices, some of the topics that we discussed in the roundtable series. So on the other hand, several calls for change have emerged in the last months from many institutional platforms, the consensus being that cultural relations should realign to global agendas such as the UN 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals and the recent Mondial Declaration on Culture, which reaffirmed the transformative impact of culture for sustainable development and the real need to add culture as a goal. So what we're going to ask tonight to our speakers is to really look at the context in which we are now, as Ambassador Morikawa was saying, also geopolitically very uncertain and very unstable, and to really understand in which way we can navigate this complex geopolitical environment and continue to develop healthy and diverse cultural relations. So with this context in mind, we have invited tonight 6 speakers from Asia and Europe, which I want to introduce to you briefly before I start to give the floor to them. So the first one on my screen on top is Jordi Balta, and I start with Jordi because Jordi was also involved in the entire process of consultation with us. Is a freelance consultant and trainer in the areas of cultural policy and international affairs, with a particular interest in the role of culture in sustainable development. Jordi is connecting from Barcelona tonight. Thank you, Jordi, and welcome to this conversation. We have also Johan Flock from On the Move. Johan has worked in independent arts organization and cultural institution, coordinating and contributing to many European cooperation projects and pilot international collaborations. He's been an external expert for government bodies and private foundation, and he's now representing the Director of Operation of On the Move and manages also FACE, a resource platform that facilitates European capacity building programs in the contemporary performing arts field. He's also connecting from Europe. Good morning to you, Johan. We then have Benjamin Hampe. Good evening, Ben, from Singapore. Ben is working as the project director of Connect ASEAN, a project developed by the ASEAN Foundation, one of the flagships program of the ASEAN Foundation. He has 16 years of experience as a consultant, has served in leadership roles for private museum, art fair, and commercial galleries. Hi, Ben. Moving on to Jasmine Ostendorf Rodriguez. I have to say, Jasmine, thank you very much, because Jasmine is connecting from Mexico. So for her, this is really the middle of the night. So extra thank you to you for waking up in the middle of the night and connecting with us. Jasmine works as a writer, curator, and researcher on art and ecology. And she founded and runs the Green Art Lab Alliance, GALA, since 2012, a network of 50 arts organizations in Europe, Latin America, and Asia that is in pursuit of fostering relationships that contribute to social and environmental justice. Hello, Jasmine. Moving on to Kamini. Kamini, hello. Kamini is based in Singapore. She's a pioneer in the field of oral storytelling in Asia, and through her network, Moon Shadow Stories, she's known for spearheading storytelling for adult audiences. She founded the nonprofit organization, the Storytelling Center Limited, to advance the art of storytelling through the Young Storytellers Mentorship Program. And finally, we have Kathy Rowland, also based in Singapore. And good evening to you, Kathy. Kathy, as many of you know, has been working in the arts for a long time, running arts and cultural program and arts media platform. She's an independent editor, writer, researcher, and she's also the founder of Arts Creator in Singapore, a site dedicated to supporting art and promoting arts criticism with a regional perspective on Southeast Asia. So with this very brief introduction, I want to move on now to our conversation for this evening. And I would like to start with Jordi, because again, as I mentioned, Jordi has a little bit of an insider view on the whole consultation that we've worked on together. So maybe Jordi, to start, I would like to ask you if you can maybe reflect on what are your ideas for revising cultural relations in light of the recent multiple crises that we've just briefly described.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vali, and pleasure to share this session with all of you, as it has also been a pleasure to accompany ASEF in this process of the set of roundtables we've run in 2022. And as you were saying, I mean, I think the landscape we've seen is one in which several challenges, very structural challenges, overlap. How COVID-19 has affected the health and well-being of communities, and how it has shown the inequalities within societies, but also things like the very precarious working conditions of many in the cultural and creative sectors. And in addition to that, I mean, we're also, of course, experiencing a very serious planetary crisis and other forms of gender and social inequalities in our societies. Now, I would say at the same time, we observed that these challenges are very much shared across societies because, I mean, of course, with differences, there's many of these factors that have a global nature and which find resonance across societies. So I would say what the roundtables have shown us and what we can observe more broadly in our societies is somehow a set of contradictory pressures. On the one hand, for some societies increasingly, or some groups within societies increasingly focusing inwards and somehow tending to reject exchange and giving precedence to domestic affairs. And at the same time, there can be a space for revising international collaboration in a way that serves also to address those inequalities and those weaknesses which are structural and which we need to address together. So I would say in terms of how we could revise cultural relations in the face of this, I think there is a potential and an important responsibility for networks, platforms, regional and international organizations and actors like ASEF to help favor and develop new ways or new forms of cultural collaboration that are more balanced, more aware of the social, economic, environmental, and broader cultural aspects that are at stake in this context. And that, of course, implies favoring more fair and more balanced and more equal cultural relations that give precedence to those countries and those groups that might be in more difficult situations, or that, let's say, are aware of those imbalances, and that at the same time take into account the responsibility of cultural and creative sectors with regard to broader social, economic, and environmental issues in their societies. And at the same time, I think it's also worth saying that let's say a lot of the things that we've been discussing in the set of roundtables have echoes in a number of initiatives which in recent years have addressed the need to develop more fair international cultural collaboration, new forms of cultural diplomacy, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important to also build on the knowledge that exists. I think we have the knowledge, and it's more a matter of putting that into action, and of course having the necessary resources to do that, but also joining forces with a number of other stakeholders that have more or less the same views and the same principles.
Thank you, Jordi. Maybe I will ask the same question to Ben, because I feel that Ben has also a lot of experience within the context of ASEAN in terms of project that you've done multilaterally. So this is also something that I'm sure you have some ideas about. You want to tell us?
Thanks, Valentina. Sorry, just get my mic back on. Yeah, I actually just leaping off from what Jordi has discussed. I think fairness in the Asia-Europe context is really important for us to talk about. I mean, I represent the ASEAN Foundation, and most of the countries that are represented by ASEAN are developing nations, bar Singapore and Brunei. And I think, well, where ASEF, or the Asia-Europe Foundation, is situated, I think, leveling the divide and kind of actually realizing this fairness is actually very, very important. I think it must be at the crux of what your work has to be in the future for you to be sustainable. And anyway, this was something that just came to mind from Jordi's introduction. I mean, look, we're all advocates here for our own work. I mean, we all understand that arts and cultural activities connect people and institutions, and we know the importance of what we do, but actually the importance of what we do right now is not a given. And we really need to remind people why our work is important. That this is actually so crucial right now in this kind of the world in which we're living. I mean, so that a lot of oxygen is being absorbed by the multiple crises rather that we're facing. Our region especially is still reeling from the pandemic. Even within the ASEAN context, all of our plans are based on COVID recovery. I guess Jordi also mentioned cultural diplomacy, and I think during the research process, I was part of the cultural diplomacy discussion. I think I may have brought up this kind of, cultural diplomacy is still a bugbear in our industry. It's something that we don't like to own. We try to, we angst over it and try and separate it from cultural relations. Okay, try to find divides in it. I think we need to retake it. I think this idea of cultural diplomacy must be something that we need to own. I mean, we can't always feel like we're being instrumentalized. I mean, it needs to go both ways. Everyone needs to use each other as a tool, to get through this. I don't think we can't just start, building up walls and divides within our, with our own patch of grass. I'll just finish off by saying I think multilateralism is so important. I mean, of course, I'm an ASEANist, so of course I'll say that. But I think, the binary of bilateral relations is what we are suffering from right now. I mean, we are in the middle of a trade war between the US and China. We are now talking about great power conflict again. It's like, a replay of the Cold War. I mean, we need to go, we need to go back to those solidarity movements. We need to understand what in that post-colonial period of the 20th century, what brought all those countries together to reimagine what it meant to be a United Nations or a regional organization such as ASEAN. I mean, I think some countries are starting to look at this idea of regionalism intentionally. There are new organizations starting to arise, and again, this is something that ASEF, I think, should be a part of and should be very aware of. I mean, you have diplomats working within your organization, so you're at the forefront anyway. So anyway, I think I may have spoken for more than 3 minutes, so I'll stop.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for throwing in all these ideas, which I think also resonate with what Jordi was saying. And I agree with you that we cannot polarize things and we cannot go into our own shelter, but we should really, just because now it's such a difficult time, tap onto this relationship and this multilaterality aspect as well. The other speakers tonight are more maybe working really on a practical level as well, in terms of relationships, in terms of building relationships in the cultural sector. So I wanted to ask them maybe a slightly different question, and I wanted to start maybe with Johan, looking at cultural relations from a more practical perspective. I wanted to know if there's anything that you would do differently or better in order to develop more inclusive and fair cultural relations, which is something that also came across in our conversation and also we were talking about now.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the kind invitation and to be contributing to this conversation. In a way, we are building up on what was said just now. On the movie is really dedicated to circulating, but also creating knowledge about international relations and international cultural mobility. So when I hear Jordi talking about the aspect of knowledge that we have and that we need to continue to grow, I think it resonated a lot with the pragmatic approach that we have. For us, what we do better now actually is to collect data, to collect information, and to be able to study the mobility flows, to establish the facts and figures that will serve for, advocating for fairer and more inclusive cultural relations. Last year, in 2022, we started a new publication called the Cultural Mobility Yearbook. And in this publication, we analyze the 700, 800 international mobility calls that we signpost every year, and to analyze these mobility opportunities were for us a great opportunity to actually establish, the very important facts about how mobility is today in the pandemic era, in the post-pandemic era, and to really delve into sustainability issues, greener mobility issues, digital or virtual mobility, access, inclusion. So I guess for us, when we started this process of developing this annual yearbook, we wanted to create a reference framework to be able to compare the data from one year to the next, to revisit these data in relation to world regions, to disciplines, to mobility formats, and really to investigate the realities and make sure that all the facts and figures, in a way, serve for the artistic communities, but also states, to be able to see where were the weaknesses or the challenges. When we do these kind of analysis, we see very clearly the limitations that are met by the field when we try to change the paradigm and to build fairer and more inclusive international relations. And of course, On the Move is very committed, as you all know, to continue to provide such valuable overview that can be useful to make strategic decisions and to make policy decisions. This year, literally in a couple of weeks, we will be publishing the 2023 Cultural Mobility Yearbook with a very strong focus on environmental sustainability. And what we can see, what I can share with you already, is that the weight of this theme in all the mobility opportunities is very big. And we can see that this theme is broadly, investigated by festivals, by artists and in residence programs. Many operators in the culture field at global level try to embrace and investigate these climate emergency. And at the same time, we can see that funders, public institutions, states, private foundations have trouble to accompany this movement. So there is a discrepancy. So it's always useful to have this kind of tool that are very practical to be able to quantify and to qualify and support the field to continue to grow in these in establishing good standards.
Thank you, Johan. I totally agree with you. The fact that data also is generally, we collect a lot of data, but who's analyzing this data is always a little bit problematic. So something like this initiative, I think it's extremely important to really understand what the trends are based on real data and also how we can adapt to that. The other point you made about the fact that there's a discrepancy between what is done on the ground and what maybe institution governments are doing is also something to keep in mind, I'm sure, and where we can also play maybe an more strong advocacy role. I wanted to move to Kathy. Kathy, for you, looking also at this more practical approach, I know that with the Arts Equator you work in the region, Southeast Asia, but also Asia more in general. What has been your experience and what kind of approaches you've kind of worked on, or your experience in this sense in terms of better relations, more fair approach to cultural relations?
Yeah, thanks, Valentina, and thanks for inviting us. I think I want to just kind of echo what Benjamin was saying about, regionality, because I'm also kind of very much about the region. But then they are also embedded within the region kind of power relations and sensitivities that if, for example, we're Singapore based, but then we're outward looking into Southeast Asia. And with that comes a particular kind of perception about imbalances of power, because in the end, it's about where the money comes from, right? And so just to answer your question, I'll just give you a little bit about background about Arts Equator. We set up 6 years ago because we felt that there was a gap in the arts ecosystem. What we observed was across the region, of course, in different levels, there was a development and growth in terms of the number of artists that were making work, the experimentation and the quality and the quantity of work that was being produced. There was also growing kind of arts infrastructure, more funding opportunities, more spaces that was coming. Some of this is influenced very much by the kind of creative industries discourse, which is problematic, but the net effect was that there was just a lot more stuff that was happening in the region. But at the same time, what we also observed was that there was a downward, quite a sharp decline in the kind of spaces that was discussing the work. So newspapers, media outlets were cutting back on their reviews and their criticism, unless it was lifestyle and could be kind of, commercialized to some extent, and I'm not anti-commercial. There was just no more space. So we then decided that, okay, this was what we would do. And we spent the next 6 years creating kind of critical content, creating reviews, critical essays, podcast, opinion pieces, timelines of cultural controversies. For example, we've done quite a lot about the documenta issue from a Southeast Asian perspective, when overwhelmingly the writing has come from a European kind of first world perspective, let's say. So we did that, and I think it was quite valued. But it was an editorial model that was very much centered in Singapore, with us kind of saying to our regional writers, can you write about this? Can you write about that? And then we did a survey. We did a reader survey, a stakeholder survey last year, supported by Spice Media Organization. So I just want to give a shout out to Spice Media. And what we found was that our stakeholders really appreciated what we did, but different stakeholders wanted different things from us. And sometimes the wants of our stakeholders were diametrically in opposition to each other. And so we realized that we were doing what a lot of arts organizations do, which is you want to do everything, you want to do it for everyone, and you want to do it with very little money. But it also revealed a structural issue, and the structural issue is that the way that we were structured was that, our stakeholders had to come to us, and the onus was then on us to make things happen for them. And so it made us kind of rethink a little bit our editorial model, right? One that was really centralized in Singapore, where the decision-making, and a lot of times our imagined reader was regional, but also it was, I think it was biased towards, let's say, a particular kind of cosmopolitan reader. And so, we're in the middle now of transforming the organization to I think, change that kind of structural, what we see as a structural kind of, imbalance. And what we're trying to do is to pivot from being publishers and commissioners and distributors of content, critical content, to actually creating funding and platforms. So creating grants for writers in Makassar, in Isabela, in Chiang Mai, in Ipoh, to write content, to be paid for, and to write content to create content that's relevant to their arts community in a language that their arts community wants to read it in, and in a format that their arts community wants to experience it in. So we're still early days. We're hoping to launch the pilot in about 3 or 4 months' time. But we think that it will be one way to kind of change the structures of, who gets to say what about the arts. And we're quite excited, to launch it, and of course make all the mistakes that you can possibly make.
Thanks, Kathy. No, this is really exciting, and thanks for sharing the whole sort of move and process of shift between your initial model and this. I completely understand, because we have Culture 360, which is also a big platform where we try to really give everything we can to all the communities out there, and sometimes it is an issue, and sometimes it is better to be a little bit more focused. But I also completely agree with you that giving grants to people who are less in the position of even reaching those grants in areas that are less visible, that are less part of this whole conversation, it's absolutely fundamental, and a lot of interesting things I'm sure will come out of it. Moving on to Jasmine. Jasmine, as I mentioned before, she started this great project of Gala in 2012, and we were also very fortunate to be sort of involved in that initial phase, and we're actually members of Gala. So I wanted to ask her from her perspective of running this network and being part of this network, which is really a global network. How do you see and what ways can you share in terms of how to build better cultural relations?
Yeah, thank you so much. And also thank you for bringing us all together, ASEF, because this is really valuable to hear. And I've just been nodding my head like crazy, listening to Johan and Kathy going like, yes, yes, I recognize so much of what everyone's saying. With the Alliance, we're working in a lot of different geographies, not only in terms of countries, but also obviously in cultures, but also some organizations are based in very rural areas, very remote, and some in cities. So you could imagine like the differences between the realities vary enormously. So it's kind of what's coming back, I think, for me really on a daily basis is this question of how we actually also have a different understanding of all the different terminologies that we are using. We're using the same words, but we mean different things, or we understand it in different things just because we are coming from a different position. So when we're talking about the word inclusive, for instance, it's like inclusive for whom, and who is asking? And the question of we, who is we? The question of fairness for whom and fairness for what? And the same with sustainability. Is sustainability about our planet, or is it about the well-being, our personal well-being? Is it about our organization? Is it about our finances? And we can really, I think, well, my experience is that we cannot make an assumption that we all have the same understanding of those terms. And then on top of that, of course, there is, the dominance of the English language and what that means for inclusivity, because, that also means a lot of people cannot participate in that dialogue. In terms of the Alliance, I think a lot of our work is obviously around climate justice, and then the word, climate also couldn't be more different to some extent, because also our climate realities vary enormously. And I think often, I mean, it happens that it becomes a lot about what we can and can't do. So it's about, oh no, but we can't fly, or you can't do this. And it just becomes very clear working with such a diversity of organizations and practitioners that there is no one size fits all. There is no one solution fits all. And so to my interpretation of FAIR is really starting from what is the reality of that practitioner. So in terms of what is the political context, what is your environmental context, what's your economical context, what is your social context? Because in some countries, yes, there is governmental funding, or there are trains, so you don't have to fly, or there is a recycling system, the infrastructure is there, but that is not the case for everyone. So when you can start from the point of, okay, there is these different realities, but then actually our values are aligned. And so something that's been really useful for us, because it's, as a group, is like a collaborative writing exercise on writing a manifesto. So then you really see like, okay, so maybe we don't want to accept any funding from fossil fuel or mining companies, for instance, but what does that mean in a different context? Or we only want to, every organization serves only vegan food. Okay, but what does that mean in this other country? So this collaborative writing has been really interesting, seeing, okay, if you write a manifesto, where can we find each other? And then that's actually been like an incredible sounding board for our conversations about where our values align, even though our realities differ.
Thank you. It's great what you're talking about, because it's, again, I think, very real in the work that we do, and the fact that, you know, we talk about inclusion, but then also in terms of terms, what do we mean, coming from different countries, completely different ways of understanding that. So yeah, thanks a lot for these words. I just want to now go to Kamini, because Kamini, from your point of view as an artist, but also an educator, and then using this powerful tool of storytelling, I think you must have experienced a lot, and I'm sure you've also looked at this big topic for cultural relations from a very real and very human to human connection point of view.
Absolutely, Valentina. Thank you to Asia Europe Foundation for getting all of us together to talk about this. You're right, it all starts with communication, and communication in itself can be problematic when you talk about who gets to communicate, who gets to tell their story, the danger of the one story, how the story is communicated, and then who are the listeners or the witnesses, right, to this communication. But more importantly, to zero in on the question that you asked, right? You know, how can we be more inclusive and fairer, thinking about cultural relations? And what would I do differently, or what can be better developed? So I want to share more from a practitioner's point of view and what is actually happening on the ground, and what artists and practitioners are trying to do, because we always find ourselves in the situation where policymakers, stakeholders, funding agencies put us in. And then so we try to adapt and adopt good practices that can trickle down, especially to emerging artists and to people that we are mentoring and teaching and training. So being involved in, you know, numerous global collaborative projects, especially in the last 3 years, I've become really aware of how participants can be very isolated due to the inequalities of language, like Yasmin just spoke about. So language comprehension or language familiarity is in itself problematic, and it is not equal when two people or more people speak. But I found that being multilingual myself, growing up in this Southeast Asian region, has been an incredible asset for me, not just as an artist, but very much in my role as a mentor and teaching artist. So I've begun to use multiple languages, especially online, right? Where you don't get to read the nonverbal cues, where everything is reliant on the small video and a lot can be missed. And I think that was one big step to be able to train and teach and speak and coach in whatever language that I felt was going to be helpful at that moment and that time to really respond to the person on the other side. Some recent projects I've encouraged participants to also support each other in the group by them becoming translators, or them stepping in to say that I can help, and then to introduce translation tools, and always making sure that there is additional time to discuss topics. So it takes a while for people to ease into communication, and then when you give them that additional time, that's where the magic happens, and that's where you can address all these gaps and inequalities. So being flexible and going in with a very creative mind that's not rigid has really, really helped. So these are very small steps, but I think what I want to impress upon is that they are respectful steps, right? Respectful steps that have provided a space so that we can have meaningful discussions where everybody is feeling heard. So this in turn will result in a more vibrant and a more active community of practice where everybody isn't holding back and they're all happy to share their thoughts and their voices. So that's what I'd like to share.
Thanks, Kamini. Thanks. Yeah, this is so important. I think already a few of you have talked about the language barrier, which I think is, again, something that all of us have experienced and we should really think of, because it's definitely something that creates that imbalance and that inequality. So if there are ways, as you described, Kamini, to do that, and I like the idea also of the participant who also become facilitator, but maybe being the one who have that capacity to speak that different language, and so they play that role as well. That's also very powerful. Maybe I'll just follow up on this question with you, Kamini, because I also wanted to ask all of you a little bit more of in your practice and in what you have seen, not only what you do, but what you've seen around you, if you've noticed or if you have anything of interest to share in terms of new ways of doing things, because I think some of these things have already come up in the first question, but maybe more specifically, if you can share something about that. Maybe Kamini, you want to start? Thanks.
So I've noticed a rise in peer organized programs. And these peer organized programs or events, they really support capability development and they encourage networking amongst us, right? Amongst the peers, this peer group of artists and cultural practitioners. I've also noticed more virtual platforms and more virtual opportunities that allow for global connections among us, again, among the artistic and creative communities. And what's been really obvious is the visibility of self-organized and artist-led collaborative projects. So it's almost like the last 3 years have allowed all of us to look at what we need and to think about specific themes and gaps that we would like addressed. And there's a kind of an urgent impatience, not wanting to wait for somebody else to figure this out. And so most of these initiatives really address what the group itself feels we need, what kind of attention we need now. So this responsive pattern is something that I've really observed. And some examples that I can think of that's very specific to kind of the work that I do is teaching artists around the world. You know, we have our own think tanks, and ITAC, the International Teaching Artists Collective, has been very supportive in helping us create these virtual connections around the world to share best practices and to support each other. And this has been going on really beautifully virtually for the last 2.5 years for sure. And then there are also very informal artist groups that use social media to connect with people around the world. And these are very private groups that you stumble upon accidentally or someone recommends to you. And they're very much focused about turning up for each other and supporting each other and taking baby steps so that it's not overwhelming. So I'm finding that these networks, even networks of international producers, right? Producers around the world getting together and thinking about what does it mean to be a producer in your country, in my country, and how can we produce across borders and collaboratively. All these seem to be new ways of doing where people are not waiting for someone else to organize or plan. And I think it's good. I think it's really healthy, and it's what creatives do, right? We see a problem and we creatively address it and fix it.
And find a solution for it. Yes. Thanks, Kamini. Yeah, this is really interesting. I think Jasmine, probably similar experience, right? Maybe you can share also a little bit on this, if you have experienced yourself or seen any new ways of doing things.
Definitely. Yeah. And again, recognizing a lot of what's being said. Something that I see a lot, I guess also because, you know, we're working in this domain of also the intersection with ecology and the arts, sustainability in the cultural sector. But there's been a lot of interest in like nature-based solutions in a lot of different ways. So one thing is, for instance, in terms of materials. So artists really wanting to work with more environmentally friendly materials, you know, non-toxic or biodegradable. One of the things that we have developed as an alliance with our partner Jan van Eyck Academy in the Netherlands is a platform called the Future Materials Bank, which is an online database to exchange knowledge and information on alternatives for sustainable materials for artists. But then not only in terms of materiality, but also in ways of thinking. So something that I've been very interested in personally is looking at biomimicry, particularly of system design. So what are the ecosystems that can inform us on how we can, design better alternatives in our ways of working and collaborating? And something that I've found highly inspirational, which might seem as a surprise for people, is the mycelium, which is the underground network of the fungus. So it's also called a wood wide web. That's how some people know it. So it's like a communication system underneath the ground, how fungi and plants and trees can redistribute resources, exchange information, be decentralized. And as an alliance, there are so many similarities actually in our ways of working that are really inspirational. That actually, for the last 2 years, I've been working on a book called Let's Become Fungal, taking like the teachings of the world of fungi and how we can implement these teachings in our ways of working, how to be mutually beneficial like fungi are, how to be decentralized like the mycelium is. And initially it seemed like it just has like a profound usefulness as metaphor, but then actually there's some very concrete teachings also to take from that. So yeah, I think you see that for a lot of people, there's an interest in biomimicry. A lot of the solutions or the ideas are already, in this world. We just need to look and observe in a different way for that knowledge to come to us. We have to listen more carefully.
Yeah, that's fascinating, really. I want to learn more about it because it's something that I was reading about when we started talking. I knew you were doing this research, but the fact that, as you said, it's not just as a sort of idea there, but really like to translate that in the work that we do, it's amazing. And there's so many new things we can learn from it. Thanks, Jasmine. Ben, I think your experience is a little bit different, but maybe you have also some interesting things to share.
It's funny you bring up mycelium because we did a conference at the end of last year with the Nanyang Technological University Center for Contemporary Arts, and we had a keynote speaker, Cynthia Ong from Forever Saba. And this maybe feeds a little bit back into what I was speaking about before, about connecting, advocacy groups that aren't particularly strictly with the arts. So she's actually an environmental activist. So we brought her in, and I'd just been watching this Netflix special on mycelium and fungus, and my partner's a pharmacist, so I got really into this idea. And then she brought it up at the conference, and I think it really feeds into this idea of multilateralism and regionalism and connecting, because I mean, the idea of this network that is the lifeblood that supports everyone, that you have mother trees and all of the little mushrooms connecting everyone and passing energy to each other. I love that idea so much. And in fact, when Cynthia brought it up, I just, kind of exploded and started talking about this Netflix special I just watched. So, look, I think finding these connections with other sectors, is really, really important for our survival, in general, and not just us as people, but for the arts and cultural sector. I think just going back to the original question about things that I noticed. During the pandemic, even our program could not function. There was no. Luckily, Valentina and I got to talking, and managed to get a virtual program up and running. And this was happening quite a lot. And it was a problem not just experienced. It was experienced by everyone, of course, even institutions and programs that they had completely broken down. And I think that those new ways of working that we discovered, I think they go on. The conversations continue. Find new ways of working. So anyway.
Yeah, I think in a way, from what you're saying, it's definitely true that these 3 years of pandemic, some learnings we've we really have from that, and we still continue to implement those formats and use those opportunities that were necessity before, and that now maybe they're not a necessity anymore, but they're still really helping us in developing connections. Kathy, what about you? What can you share in terms of new ways of doing from your point of view of arts equator, but also from what you've noticed and observed around you, also in the region?
Yeah, it's also kind of pandemic inspired, but nowhere near as charming, as fungi and mycelium, unfortunately. Yeah, so one of the things that, that came out of the roundtable that ASEF did was this idea of, that arts organizations generally kind of an artist had a lot of were quite progressive, and they had a lot of cultural capital and could push governments and other organizations to, for example, take on progressive causes, whether it's the climate and so on. But the one thing that I've noticed, I've noticed lots of things that everyone's saying here really, kind of resonates with me. But one thing that I maybe wanted to share was that I'm also noticing that there's a turning inwards and a kind of shining the light back on the industry, an industry that sees itself as, as progressive, as equitable. What I've observed is that there seems to be, there have been kind of pockets of artists, art workers along the whole kind of ecosystem who are questioning, challenging the way that the arts industry itself works, the kinds of practices, whether they're labor practices, whether it's about self-care, it's about sexual harassment or other kinds of abuse that really have been quite prevalent within our own community. And it's striking that young people now are, not just young people, but people are willing to talk about it. And I think partly that's been inspired by the Me Too movement, but it's also come about because artists were really confronted by how precarious their livelihoods and their whole being was when the pandemic hit. It really is, it is true that while artists we pride ourselves as being kind of forward-looking and non-conforming and hyper-aware, as someone who's worked in the arts for, kind of 30 years, it is shocking. It is shocking how hierarchical it can be, how patriarchal it can be. And often it's under the guise of, well, if you're passionate and if you believe in the arts and you do this, then, so young people entering the arts sector kind of face this kinds of, romanticism, right? It's okay, you'll be paid much less, but, you will work much longer hours and there will be very little health and safety precautions and safety nets for you, but, you're an artist, So I think these have been quite daunting. I think these daunting working conditions of long kind of hours, little pay, kind of dangers and physical and emotional, mental kinds of dangers that they've had to face. I'd like to say that, a lot of arts workers, myself included, we're kind of like, we're really glamorous blue collar workers, because if you look at the ratio of our pay versus our educational kind of background versus the number of hours that we work, it's incredible. It's incredible. I remember reading an article about that said that New York, so a New York publishing executive with an MFA earns less than a postal worker in Philadelphia, right? And so I wanted to kind of highlight three small initiatives that I've observed in the region, two of which are in Singapore and one in Indonesia. One is called Citrus Practice, which is Singapore-based. The other is called Good Practices in Singapore Theatre. And then the third is Shifting Realities in Indonesia. And these are all kind of initiatives rather than organizations. They're groups of people that have come together to address issues of self-care, to address issues of income inequality within the arts sector, right? In Singapore, in some parts in the two areas I know well, Malaysia and Singapore, there's definitely a working class versus, middle class, upper middle class divide between, for example, the crew that works on a theatre production, and the people that are on stage. I think that maybe we need to really kind of support these kinds of emerging themes and concerns in any way that we can. Those of us that have been around longer, or those of us that are in positions of power, institutional power, they have got more cultural capital, let's say, than some of these young groups. Because of course they're putting themselves in a slightly awkward position. You're entering the sector. You want to build your career, but at the same time you're critiquing the practices of the sector, right? So I think for me, if we can address these gaps and inequalities and hierarchies within the sector itself, it not only are we modeling behavior for the people that we're for the societies that we're trying to change, but I think it makes the arts organizations also more resilient.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. I think we are all in the same sort of situation, and this fact that it's a sector that is so informally structured also, it's one of the reasons why things are so less clear, and in a way this romanticizing of it's all true. I mean, we are all working more than we would like to, but then at the same time we do great jobs, so it's fine. So it's great that you kind of notice these new trends that are happening within the sector, and then also of young people who are coming in. And maybe the pandemic also helped in that, because after that crisis time, now people are more vocal and more ready to just say, I work in this sector, but I also want to work in a better way, if you want. So maybe moving on to Johan. Johan, what is your experience? What can you share in terms of new ways of doing?
I mean, I'm very inspired, and I have to say I echo everything that I hear so far. Really resonate with our own experience and my own experience as a researcher, also investigating, working conditions of artists, accessibility for disabled artists and disabled cultural workers. I mean, everything you say, Kathy, but also Kamini, are really resonating a lot. What I see is, because of this level of awareness, or this knowledge, this visibility of all the issues, even in our own cultural field, I see that we all try to navigate paradoxes constantly. And this is our big work, the biggest trend probably. As Yasmin was saying, values align and realities differs. And because of this, we are constantly trying to cope with many different realities that are somehow antagonistic, or feel like they are. But I want to say not everything is doom and gloom. And I'm optimistic, not only by nature, but also because I can see that many civil society organizations, NGOs, cultural networks at European, international level are really advocating for more, fairer practices and more inclusive practices. And it feels like all these voices are heard. And at least in Europe, it feels like even the political level, public institution, etc., align somehow with our own objectives and align with the values we are somehow defending. So I want also to put a positive note in this, because it feels like, of course, we are more advanced, and we feel sometimes we are more advanced than the political bodies and the funders, etc. Just to give you an example, as you know, in On the Move, we work on cultural mobility funding guides. So we map funding sources to support the mobility of artists and cultural workers. And we can see lately, working on the Balkan region, on Africa and Northern Africa, that many funders and international funders have trouble to take into account environmental sustainability, have trouble to take into account specific circumstances like disability, or to take into account gender balance, etc. But still, they are aware, and they try to develop new strategies and policies. So I want to probably bring a positive aspect to this. Also, because, and these are the examples that were given already by my colleagues, I feel that the field is very proactive in proposing standards and, updating what are the good practices. And in many aspects, from gender-based violence to, accessibility or inclusion. I feel we are very good also at setting up standards, and I can see that we are good also at implementing them, not just having the ideas, but actually adopting new ways to work. Maybe the next challenge will be, how do we make sure we share all these responsibilities and it goes beyond us, beyond the cultural field? And how do we share responsibilities? Because I really believe that the artists, the individual cultural workers, the small grassroots cultural organization, they cannot take all the responsibilities. So we need to share these responsibilities. But I want to be positive.
Thank you. Thanks, Johan. Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear that, there's also from the government level an awareness on that and some action on that. And maybe this is something I also wanted to ask Jordi about, because I know you work more in the context also of UNESCO internationally. Is this something you have also observed, that not only from the sector there is, a really strong push to find new ways of working, but also from government sector to sort of align with these new ways? Maybe you can share about that.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think first of all, the range of experiences we're seeing, despite the difficulties that everyone is experiencing in their own context, shows that there's quite a lot of thinking and revising of our practices. And I would say to a certain extent, that is also reflected in policies at different levels, although, as it has also been said, often, let's say, the pace of development is different, and things in certain contexts, because of the nature, might move more slowly. But hopefully, at some point, there's an alignment, and I think there's positive trends in that respect. Now, also, I wanted to share some of these emerging practices that I found inspiring recently. And first of all, it's already been mentioned, but I think in the context of the Recalibrating the Compass set of roundtables that ASEF organized last year, as a European, I was particularly struck by many experiences coming from Asia that are not always very visible, at least in our context, but which I found were very, very inspiring in terms of local organizations working with minority groups and with rural communities, or with other forms of community groups, organizations that are working to foster a freedom of artistic expression in very difficult situations, engaging in more sustainable and more ethical practices. And as it has already been said, it's, of course, we always need to consider what's the meaning of sustainability in different contexts. And I'm referring both to the environmental implications, but to a broader and more holistic understanding of sustainability that also integrates the social, the cultural, and the revision of the economic models that lie behind. And I think Julia earlier shared the link to the set of reports that have been produced from the Recalibrating the Compass. And by the way, thanks to Julia, because I'm just looking at the chat and the number of links she's been sharing, and it's quite impressive. And I'm looking forward to checking lots of those initiatives. Now, another experience that I wanted to share is I wrote a report for the European Dance House Network a few months ago on contemporary dance and environmental sustainability. And the report presented or helped us to identify several very interesting examples of how dance organizations are dealing with environmental sustainability in their work. I don't know, I can think of organizations like the Duncan Dance Research Center in Athens that is integrating principles of permaculture in their work, and, let's say, developing environmental work and agricultural work and educational activities in their surroundings. But also, from several of the people that we talked to, there were very interesting reflections on how thinking about more sustainable ways of working also implies challenging the traditional models of production in contemporary dance, but more broadly in the arts, which tend to be based on always having to develop new productions, and let's say that obsession with the new, which might need to be challenged, and somehow giving more space to educational work, to community work, to touring and presenting work that already exists and which is less depleting of resources and so on. So I think that there were very interesting reflections in that respect. And in the report, we also try to present a set of principles to be applied contextually, because I agree that the conditions can be very different depending on the social and political and economic context where you're operating. But basically the idea was to present a set of principles to be applied contextually on how to develop more environmentally sustainable mobility. And indeed taking into account a holistic range of factors. And then, yeah, I would say also more locally in Catalonia, where I'm based, we've also been doing some work on the arts, health and well-being, and looking at some interesting experiences in that respect. And then, I mean, among the different examples that I found interesting are that of museums that are developing more welcoming spaces, and spaces, let's say, which are meant particularly or initially thought for people with disabilities or people with particular health conditions, but which by becoming more welcoming for those groups of people end up being more welcoming for everyone, because all of us can somehow benefit from more inclusive and welcoming spaces. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the Museum of Art in a town called Cerdanyola near Barcelona, but there's several others that are interesting as well.
Thanks, Jordi. Thanks. Yeah, I think there's quite a few very interesting things out there that we can look at. But as you said, also some points that came out from the roundtable discussion that were really useful, and I think put in context is something that we can really act on. And this brings me to the last part of our conversation. I think we have still 20 minutes, but I have one question that I want to ask you, which is, of course, nearer to my heart because it's also part of the work that we do at ASEF. As you can imagine, cultural relations, we started from the bigger picture. We went into real examples, practices of things that are happening, but there are organizations like ours that operate in this very big, broad context, and we are really very much looking at ways to collaborate with others and ways in which we can improve, because sometimes you look at organizations like ASEF, they've been around for 25 years, they're sort of funded by governments, there is sort of an institutional importance in the mission of the organization, but then we need to also be realistic and adapt to the day-to-day life of the things that are happening and that are changing. And so this brings me to my question about what ASEF can do, or what role you think ASEF can play. It could be that we already do it. I hope that we already do some good things in this area, but maybe there are some ideas or some other areas that you can suggest where you think that we could play a role as well. Of course, in terms of bringing Asia and Europe nearer and creating a better cooperation between these two regions and between the people working in the sector. So maybe asking this question about ASEF and what role you see ASEF playing. Who wants to start? I don't know. Maybe shall I ask Ben? I see he's moving towards the mic. Ben.
I think I can help you, Valentina.
Please.
Because our organization was in a similar situation. I mean, ASEAN actually just thought arts and cultural projects were too hard and didn't do them for like 15 years until very, very recently. I mean, it seems like a lot of course, we work directly with governments, but we're not policymakers. And I assume that ASEF is in a similar position. So, I mean, one thing that we are working on at the end of our program is we will do a report back to all of our stakeholders, including governments and our funders, and those reports will be full of recommendations. So I've heard a lot of talk about labor issues, fairness. I mean, ASEAN, of course. I mean, we don't have to just talk about ASEAN, but because, I mean, if we're talking across Europe and Asia, the norms are very, very different. But I mean, this is the difficulty, of course, when you're working with multilateral organizations. Or what is, you know, are we supposed to come up with a norm? Are we supposed to work with a norm? Do we work in particular ways with other countries? But so, I mean, this is a conversation I think that is worth us having. And you know, and we could come up with some kind of recommendations, and this could turn into another project in and of itself. I mean, look, our program is very focused. We're a visual arts program. We don't try and do everything, and we're not all things to everyone. It's impossible. But our organization is a public diplomacy organization, so they have other programs. They have gender rights programs. They have you know, youth programs. They have educate. So you know, we take something from those programs as well and integrate them into what we do. But I think I mean, at least for us, we needed something that was, you know, focused and we could do well. Otherwise, the programs aren't sustainable. They will happen once and then they'll never happen again. Yeah, I think there we go. That's my suggestion for Valentina.
Perfect. Thank you. Everything is recorded, so I don't have to take notes. Thanks, Ben. Who wants to go next? Maybe, I don't know, Jasmine, would you like to?
Yes, there we go. Yes, well, I'm not completely objective, obviously, when I say this, but there's two things that I'm a big fan of that there's a lot of things that you do that I'm a big fan of, but two things in particular, obviously, are the guides, like the Creative Responses to Sustainability series that we started 2015, I think, and it's been really amazing to see how that continued. And I still get emails today from people from all over the world saying, "Oh, I want to make a Creative Responses to Sustainability guide," and people using these mappings.
Send them to us.
Yeah, no, definitely. So it's just been really great to see there has been such an interest in that. And then also, I was really happy, or I always hear a lot of good things about the Mobility First program, that it's really like easy, let's say, to apply, or it's very inclusive in that sense. And yeah, that's also because I'm still, you know, I come from the world of residencies, and that's still something that I really believe in. You know, even though, you know, we have to cut down on our travel and the pandemic, we couldn't, but I really still believe somehow that proximity grows solidarity, and in an accelerated form. And so to be able to spend time together in person just has like an incredible effect on things, in terms of creating that solidarity. So yeah, residencies, fellowships, mentorships, really those ways for people to come together, I think are really really important. And yeah, you've been doing really well in that. And then the last thing I suddenly just thought of is in terms of advocacy, like you're actually ideally located because you know so many people in the field, you have such good, healthy relationships with the stakeholders, but then also that strong relationship with cultural policy, and that network. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that can be further developed in that sense.
Thanks. Thank you.
But you're doing fine.
No, I think just one comment about the Mobility First, because we, as you know, we had to discontinue that program last year, unfortunately. But the thing is that we are actually shifting also voluntarily that kind of support to more residency programs, because, okay, again, with the pandemic, there was really a need to connect people virtually because it started as a virtual residency. But we are also, now it's the 5th one that we've run, and we also really realized that it's so powerful to bring people together. And it's amazing how even if they don't meet physically, but just online, there's been amazing exchanges. I think Kamini would be able to tell you more about that because she was in the last one we did. But yeah, something to really continue to develop. So perhaps not necessarily in terms of mobility grants, but in terms of capacity building for the sector, and also for younger people, for people who are coming into the cultural field as well, who maybe are not yet sure of what they want to do or how they want to do it. It's something that might be useful to continue doing for them as well. Can I ask Johan for his...
Yes, it's going to be very much in line with what Yasmin just said. I mean, of course, we want mobility, and not just the digital one. I mean, also the in-person one. What I think is ASEF has been very good in creating frameworks and in maintaining cultural relations, even in difficult times, but also has the potential to renew and to support new forms of cultural exchanges. What I see is ASEF as able to open doors. What we see a lot is that there is a strong demand from non-state stakeholders to be closely associated to the design or the co-design of forward-looking policies, and to be able to continue to inform decision makers on all these, highly relevant issues: green transition, diversity, inclusion, etc. So ASEF could really play a role in this, and in being this intermediary, and has all the legitimacy to actually create the frames for these exchanges. And also, we're talking a lot about the cultural field, cultural practitioners, artists, but I would like to involve more also all the officials, the arts councils, officers, all the people working in administration, public institution, because they are allies. We are part of the same boat. We are navigating on the same waters. So I think I can see ASEF really conveying regularly all these stakeholders to create spaces of exchange and to make sure that we support each other, because we are, again, part of the same ecosystem, and to make sure that these in-person exchanges can really have both a context-based approach, but also make sure that we build valuable, rich, artistic, social, economic, human relations. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Johan. Who did I meet? Oh, maybe Kathy? Yes.
So I'm a fan. And I think it's, as I said, it's quite unique in how it's kind of public and private. It's kind of regional. It's it branches. It kind of bridges these two powers. But I just wanted to maybe pick up just to kind of, I think, going back to the roundtable, and one of the things I think the second roundtable they talked about is of kind of being able to lead this collaborative process, and that's what I think Johan and also Jasmine was talking about, which is to kind of really, there are few organizations that I can think of that can actually bring the kinds of partners that are from different geopolitical kind of spaces, but also from, kind of really small avant-garde indie arts practitioners, as well as, kind of getting the heads of national arts councils together. So, that kind of enabling policymakers to listen to what artists have to say, and also making artists listen to what policymakers have to say, because I think it is a really two-way street. So I think it's and I'm glad that was one of the things that came up in the roundtable, because I think it's a really important function. I really see the value of Culture 360. I think that the work that it does is really it's maybe underappreciated, because I know running a website, how much of work goes into that, into kind of gathering information. I think it would be great if, it was in a different language. It was not only in, for example, in English. I think that is a real issue, because, speaking from within the region, language is so cleaved to class and economic access that we can say that we're diverse, because, you've got so many different artists from Southeast Asia, for example, or Asia involved. But is it in terms of class? Is it diverse in terms of class? So I think that maybe is something that I would like to see. And I think also coming back to that is this idea of the, kind of decolonizing the flow of information. I think there's been a lot of changes in cultural relations over the past 30 years, but it does still, I still come up, to this kind of sense of programs that are designed, even if it's not explicit, the programs very much are about, bringing kind of senior artists from a kind of North or advanced economy. And it's not always Asia, Europe, it can be Asia, but, artists from countries that have got a lot of money and therefore are funding the programs and dictate the terms of the program. So I don't know if, one of the things, if I think about what role ASEF can play, I think about it as being an organization that might be able to be, agnostic about this, about where your funding comes from, whether it's from a, it's from a rich European or a rich Asian government, but can, is there a way that programming is designed regardless of where the money comes from, but it's, it is from a pool that has a collective desire to bridge the gap.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I think the reason why ASEF is an interesting organization is because we actually really are doing that, in the sense that all these governments that are sort of finding ASEF the good intermediary between the government level and civil society and playing that role, they actually really fund with the idea that that funding is going into ASEF and not going into one activity or another. So that is the great, I think, great value of this kind of project that we do, because they are in a way funded by all this government, but also supported, jointly by all these governments, without saying, oh, because one has given more, the other one has given less. So that, in general, it's what's happening, which is good. But of course, there's always some complexities, and that, it's part of the work that we do. But I agree with you also in terms of the language barrier. That's something, for example, that we've heard so many times and that we want to really act on, because it's not even a question for us in terms of what Culture 360 content, for example, propose. It's not even a question of looking at the, like people who maybe are from different work class or different type of society. It's really, we are not really reaching to all of our member countries also, because some countries don't use English, don't use the same social media, don't have the same communication system. So we are aware that we are actually losing out on a lot of opportunities and access to information on arts and culture for certain countries that we work on. So that's a valuable point as well. So I hope that we can address that in some way or another. Maybe Kamini, you wanted to add a few points as well from your side, from your experience working with us, but also more broadly in terms of organization that operate like ours, I would say.
Yep, thanks, Valentina. Yes, I've worked on the virtual residencies, and being a mentor and someone who was able to make a difference last year. I do echo what Yasmin has mentioned about fellowships, virtual and hybrid and physical and in-person mentorships. But there's something that I was thinking about. You mentioned it's 25 years, right? Yeah. So if you look at it as a following of people that have been with you for the last 25 years, where are all these people now? What stages are they at? Where are all these organizations, these cultural and arts practitioners? So even if they started at ground zero, they are 25 years later, somewhere now doing something. So what I personally feel as a practitioner that's lacking, and you kind of opened up the opportunity for me to share my wish list with you, is leadership, right? So leadership is what will really foster cultural diplomacy, and specific leadership programs catered for arts and culture that leads into all the topics that we've just shared, all the six of us today. That would be something to look into, and that would be something that would take you into the next cycle of the next 25 years. Because to make a difference, you need the right leaders in arts and culture. So that would be the wish list that I put down here. Thanks, Vali.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just looking at time and I realized that it was so interesting to be part of this conversation. Personally, I wasn't really paying attention. I should have. So maybe I would just take a few extra minutes to maybe give space to some of the people who are taking part in the conversation to ask questions. And I have a question with some interesting comments from Maria Kodbitska, who is from working in Spain. And she's asking, I'm very interested in the expert's opinion on the combination of cultural diplomacy and cultural relations. Unfortunately, the world is very turbulent right now, regardless of regions, and want to ask a very practical question about the approach to this idea. I realize that it's a complicated question, but I have already experienced in practice how this combination works. Do you think there is a need for a certain limit beyond which art and culture can be an instrument of politics and influence? Should there be a certain responsibility to keep this relationship healthy? And then even if we are talking about language, it can also become an instrument of political influence through culture. So it's a lot of questions. It's not only one, but it's quite comprehensive, I would say, of all the things that we discuss. I don't know if there's anyone in the group who maybe wants to try and answer this very detailed and complex topic.
Initial go, Valentina, just because I mentioned it at the beginning.
Yes.
But, yes. I mean, just because we work for a political organization, all artwork that goes into our programs is by definition political. And even if it's trying not to be political, that is a statement in itself. And I think, I mean, there was a time in ASEAN's history when this idea of cultural diplomacy was basically poo-pooed so much that it completely it became inert. It wasn't able to do any programs because the regional cultural community decided that ASEAN kind of diluted everything to a base level, and it wasn't. Well, they had no artistic value anymore. I mean, I think we're in a different time now. I think there's a bit. I mean, I think the reason why we have these definitions between cultural diplomacy and cultural relations is because of the history of how cultural diplomacy has been realized. It's very loaded, especially in Southeast Asia. I mean, the immediate thing that comes to mind is CIA. As soon as I think about cultural diplomacy during the Cold War. So I think we're in a different time now. I mean, most governments know that if they do these types of programs and they're too heavy-handed on the political side, they won't work. The intention is then completely decimated. I mean, by and large, these are soft power initiatives. It's government showing that they have a sophistication, that they understand how the industry works. They want to be involved, but by and large, I'll say by and large, they want to be involved in these programs, and they want these conversations to happen and for things to kind of develop naturally and for them to continue to sustain and to go on. I mean, every now and then you get a different type of program which comes up, which of course still happens, but that may depend on the nation. So, I mean, I'm not entirely sure if that answers the question that was asked, but I can say from personal experience, I think cultural diplomacy means something different for people who practice it now, and I think that there is a better understanding with people who are in this space from all sides, from government to diplomats to people working in the arts and artists.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks. Yeah, I agree with you. I think things have luckily changed and evolved quite a bit in terms of what we mean by cultural diplomacy, but also, of the actors that are involved, of the people that are actually working more together in this sense, and not just government-led initiatives that, as you said, then don't really work if they are sort of imposed in a way or in another. There's another question, and I think I will have to take only one because we are really short on time. Someone is asking, I'm interested in any examples of how the demonstration of best practice and the ability to revise and review issues by artists and micro-organizations like grassroots can influence government policy to empower the cultural sector. So I don't know if this is a question, I don't know, maybe Jasmine or someone working more at grassroots level, if you have any, I don't know, I'm just thinking anyone wants to answer to take this question. It's basically how we can influence government from really like very grassroots level. And that, I think, sorry, just one thing, this is probably where organization that can be intermediary play also a role to bring those ideas from the grassroots level to governments. Yes, Jasmine.
I actually think Jordi raised his hand.
Sorry, who?
Jordi raised his hand, I think. So I would be happy to pass a question to him.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Yes. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you very much for this. Actually, I had raised my hand for the previous
Sorry, I don't know.
Okay.
but I'm happy. I don't know. Maybe I'll give the floor to Yasmin for this one, and if there's time, I can
yes,
add
please.
something later.
Or maybe both of you, if you want to comment on this. Thanks.
All right. Okay, so look at about this final question on the ability and let's say in the work that can be done from the ground. I mean, I think let's say there's different examples probably of like particularly federations and umbrella organizations of small grassroots organizations joining forces to lobby for policy change. One example that comes to mind, and it's let's say it's not exclusively the work of grassroots organizations, but I'm actually taking part in a research report with On the Move in the context of a European project called Europe Beyond Access, which is for the accessibility of disabled artists and disabled audiences in the performing arts in particular. And some of the changes that we are observing in terms of making cultural policies more aware of the realities of disabled artists and disabled audiences in countries like Italy, Poland, or Sweden, they've been driven by grassroots organizations and groups of disabled artists, for instance. So, I mean, this is like one example that comes to mind now.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, Jasmine, thanks, Jordi.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because actually a lot of the organizations that are part of the Alliance are very, obviously very grassroots and very political, but also a lot of them are quite activist. Obviously with an intent to change things and to have their voices heard. But that can also be a complicated position, let's say, because not everyone is in a safe environment or in a safe country to actually do protest. So that's always quite interesting to understand from these partners, like really on that level, like what are their fears, what are their concerns. And my experience is that with this, it's really interesting to really be truly global, because then when there is a problem in one country and there has been a protest or there's been like even lawsuits, how then we can connect with like pro bono environmental lawyers in other countries. So I think from my personal experience, it's very much in on the level of grassroots kind of activism, and how do you translate those messages that are very urgent and very complicated, let's say, into also language, into a way of communicating that is usable for other institutions. And I think to go international is a really useful way for that. So really the institutions or the councils that work intercontinental, let's say. But then, yeah, it depends on what kind of example, what kind of solutions or the question is looking for. But this is from my personal experience.
Thanks. I think we are coming to a close. I already almost 10 minutes more. I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to say anything before we wrap up this session. Oh, okay, all good. I saw some other questions and comments, and I thank you everyone who attended for those questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to address them, but I personally think this was one of the most interesting conversations I've been part of. So I hope that everyone enjoyed it in the same way I did. A lot of things were discussed, a lot of very interesting points were touched upon. And I think from the point of view of ASEF, we will really cherish all of this information and come up with the final document which will sort of summarize this, but we'll also try to bring in those ideas in the way we work and in the partnerships that we build, with the idea that I think the most important thing is that we develop human connections, and we continue to do that, even though we come from maybe very different experiences and very different countries. So with all the speakers tonight, thank you so much for joining me. And to all the audience out there, thank you so much for attending. Please stay in touch with us. Look at our newsletter. We have a lot of new things coming up. Some of them already answering some of the points that were brought into this discussion. I won't reveal anything, but hopefully this year we'll come up with some new ideas and work together towards better cultural relations between Asia and Europe. Thanks so much for your time, and good night, everyone.